So thank you. This is the 10:15 session. We're in day 2 of Dawn or Doom 2018. And the conversation today is about the vital need for data science and data literacy in the age of big data. So Purdue kicked off a major data science initiative this year with a goal of preparing every Purdue student with a fundamental understanding of data science in their chosen field. Why is it important that the average engineering or science major, not to mention philosophy or English majors, have exposure to data science? What are the applications and implications for engineering, science, and other fields? It would be hard to find 2 better people to talk about these questions than Mung, Chiang, Purdue's Edwardson Dean of the College of Engineering and George Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and Patrick Wolfe, the Hovde Dean of Science and Miller Professor of Statistics and Computer Science. President Daniels has described Dean Chiang, whose research revolves around communications networks and edge computing, as one of the genuine superstars of American engineering and higher education. Internationally recognized for his research and scholarship in data science, Dean Wolfe has provided expert advice on applications of data science to policy, societal, and commercial challenges to the US and UK governments, and to a range of public and private bodies. My name's Gerry McCartney. I'm the Osterly Professor of Information Technology and the Executive Vice President and CIO here at Purdue. And I'll be facilitating the discussion and trying not to be crushed by these 2 towering intellectuals. What we'll do here is I'm going to start with 2 or 3 questions just to warm us all up a little bit. And then we'll take a gap. The whole thing runs until about 11 o'clock, so we don't have a lot of time. As questions occur to you, please come down to one of the mics, and I will stop wherever we're up to and take your questions. If nobody can think of any single question that they want to ask, I will just keep asking questions until somebody gives in and comes and stands at the mic, all right? So thank you for that. So let me ask Dean Chiang first. It may be history to some people, but some of us are old enough in the room to remember 1984, the novel by George Orwell. Big data promises a lot, but also threatens a lot. Tell us about your view of big data in this positive and negative situation.
Well, big data is bad. Big data can be bad. I know that you told Patrick and I to be provocative, so I just delivered that. Big data is bad. Big bad data.
Big bad data.
And it can be bad. I think that the scenario in 1984 will stand a real chance to be enabled by big data and AI in the hands of dictatorial regimes, and with the help of companies such as Google that is increasingly becoming evil. And the scary scenario that authoritative or dictatorial government can keep track of everything that you do and infer your mind and control every aspect of your life, that is becoming a reality.
Dean Wolfe, would you agree completely with Dean Chiang's position?
Well, Gerry, I think that's a slightly loaded question on your point. And I mean, I think I would say that and I'm going to move to a first name basis
Thank
here.
you. Yes,
that's okay.
Yes, why not?
I think I would say that much of Mung's point is grounded in reality, and maybe to expand on that a little bit. Last night we had a very nice talk, which again was meant to be just a little bit provocative about our kind of cultural addiction to our smartphones and what that means about not just the ways that we take in information, but sort of what it's potentially doing to our brains. So I think there are a couple of factors here that are very real. The first is that commercial entities, as Mung alluded to, have a stake in keeping us involved in various personal technologies for as much of the time as possible in order to maximize advertising revenue, which in turn maximizes bottom line for shareholders. And that is purely a function of capitalism. That's how things work. So that affects all of us, I think, in every society. In societies that are less freer and open than our own, as a second point, the ability to use the same set of tools enabled by big data, but really further enabled by rapid advances in artificial intelligence and data science technologies. The ability of regimes to use the data and the information about us for purposes of restriction, control, nudging, whatever you'd like to call it, is certainly manifest. And the technologies have just matured so quickly that it wasn't long ago that we were all surprised about the ability of Twitter and other media to enable the Arab Spring. Here we are, less than a decade later, and a very different subject of conversation are things like the personality scoring system that's been piloted in mainland China, and the effects that things like that might have on society. So I think we'll come to this point later, but some of the technologies are constant and pervasive across the globe, whether you're talking about a G8 economy or a developing nation, but the sort of socio-political privacy, ethics, and cultural manifestations of big data and these enabling technologies, I think they're already kind of playing out quite distinctly in different parts of the world. So I think there's a lot of realism in what Mung is saying. I wouldn't want that to turn into scaremongering, but I do think we would do well to sort of look around us carefully and assess the opportunities and challenges, the benefits and costs associated with this technological revolution.
Right. And so, one of the driving forces behind this event, it's now in its 5th year, has been this sense that we're at a stage, and it's a popular concept among some branches of sociology. People always think the age they live in is the most important age. But there does seem to be this sense now that there's opportunities and perils that we hadn't anticipated. We've touched a little bit on some of the perils, Mung. Tell us about some of the exciting areas of research around big data and the opportunities for analytics.
Well, I'll say number one is stop big data and protect privacy, security, anonymity in the age of big data. That, in my mind, is the most exciting, important research in big data. So that instead of doom, we may have the dawn there. And beyond that, I'll say one very exciting area that I'm doing research myself is try to make it interpretable, make the results from big data to be intelligent to a human understanding. What is the intuition behind it? So for example, this was maybe 5 years ago. One of my students and I, we wrote a paper and submitted to the Yelp Open Data Challenge. And he was able to win this grand prize that year. And then we look at the results. Say, all right, what does this mean to human brains? And we couldn't quite figure out. I mean, the data says this is the right prediction. And Yelp liked it a lot. And the methodology we used were better than the other competitors in that year. But what does that mean, right? Another example is one of my startup companies is in the AI space for learning analytics. Again, I keep going to the results and say, yes, I know the data is telling me this, but I'm still not getting it. I'm not intuitively understanding As opposed to decades ago, education experts would tell me there are 4 types of learner, and then they give English names to their behavior, and I have an intuitive understanding. Now it says this is one of the 283 dimensions. It turns out to be more important than the others, and then here's the right convex combination of the different feature vector. And don't ask me what does it mean. I just give you a very good, powerful algorithm. So making those understandable. And maybe one more is a dispersive view of AI as the edge computing, as you mentioned, and fog computing that I work on a lot. One of the nonprofit consortium called Open Fog that I helped create is spending a lot of time to look at how we can disperse computing and AI away from the cloud and the data center and among the intelligent connected things surrounding us.
Open Fog. Very good.
Open fog. Well, but compared to dawn and doom, at least we're not trying to alliterate.
That's very good. So, Patrick, I mean, Mung has raised an interesting point there. And, a couple of our speakers yesterday, in particular, Frank Pasquale, who's a law professor at Maryland, illustrated the gap that exists between our capabilities technically and our public policy formulations and laws around this. Would you talk a little bit about that gap for us, please?
Yeah, and I think, Gerry, as you said, it follows on sort of directly from Mung's second point about our ability to understand and interpret and make sense of volumes and varieties of data, the likes of which we've never before been able to collect. So let me sort of use that to kind of step into to the way in which I would have answered the last question that you asked, which is that I think the single most important thing about the data revolution is that it's so clearly set to transform every sector of commerce and society. So it's very, very difficult to find or to envision an area, a business or a part of society that's going to remain untouched by this. So why does that lead us back to the importance of understanding and interpretability? Well, if you think about the kind of the sort of technical heritage of the methods that collectively we now call artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I'm not sort of talking about the sort of futurist, what might be in 40 years. I'm talking about the implementable tools that we can access right now, and the skills that would get you hired as an engineer at Facebook or a programmer at Google, et cetera. The technological heritage of these tools comes again from the commercial sector, exactly as in the example that Mung gave. When Amazon started recommending books, for example, online, the only alternative was no recommendations, right? So if Gerry gets recommended some books on gardening that are useful and some books on fishing that are useless to him, it's still a win for Amazon because the alternative is no recommendations at all. So any recommendation system can only have upside, commercial upside. It can only drive business from Gerry to Amazon. Now, that led pretty naturally then to a focus on building purely predictive black boxes, right? Now we want to improve Amazon's recommendation systems, but we don't really need to understand the social science of why Gerry happens to prefer gardening to fishing. All we need is a black box with very good predictive qualities. And if you build the box with the best predictive qualities, exactly as the case Mung alluded to with his student, you drive Yelp's bottom line, for example, you win the Netflix prize, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the sort of framework in which current technologies have matured. So the big challenge when we try to take those techniques and translate them to bigger questions, whether it's public policy, healthcare, climate modeling, take your pick. The big challenge is none of these algorithms were developed with transparency or explainability in mind. And frankly, they were developed in scenarios where the cost of getting it wrong is pretty much nil. Google search is another example. A good search algorithm is one that returns something useful in roughly the top 10 hits, right? If you're a doctor, think about Watson at IBM, and there were something like 600 job losses when the plug was pulled on the Watson project after IBM had invested a lot of money in trying to make Watson a useful healthcare tool to interact with doctors. If I'm a physician, a neurosurgeon, what have you, and I query Watson for some assistance with a difficult patient, I sure as heck don't expect something useful in the top 10 results and a bunch of other misleading things. The cost of getting it wrong is much, much greater.
Yeah, very good.
So I think that's exactly what shows up some of the challenges when we try to now bring these technologies that have been invented in purely predictive contexts and try to port them over to more important, bigger challenges.
Right. So I'm just going to pause here for a second and say, if you've got some questions, now would be a good time to kind of drift towards these microphones. Otherwise, you're going to have to put up with my ramblings for a while. There are students in the room, and there are students, I think, from high school, but certainly college students here. And all yesterday, we heard everything's going to be different, and now we heard some more everything's going to be different. What can people in the room whose most of their life is still ahead of them do to prepare for this different world in a practical way? Like it's, Tuesday morning now. What can I go and do on Wednesday morning to help myself here a little bit? Mung.
Well, I'll say start by going to actual normal classes on Wednesday morning. Because the wonderful event by Gerry, Dawn and Doom will end by Tuesday night.
That's right.
Otherwise, skip classes and keep coming to Dawn and Doom. Well, let me also, again, try to be provocative here. I've been told that nothing is new under the sun. I've been told that nothing is new since the 1960s. And in a lot of my own research area, actually, I can trace back and see that, indeed, not much new on the theory side since the 1960s. And on more optimistic dates, I would think otherwise. But I would say that the common characteristics of curiosity, the ability to pick up new things and learn new things on your own, and a relentless pursuit of something interesting that's beyond your day-to-day. Those are the kind of characteristics will continue to drive intellectual success in the young minds and the minds of tomorrow. Whether big data, machine learning, AI will be the kind of things they want to pursue or not, I think a lot of that depends on what their interest levels are. But one thing is probably true, and that is some basic exposure, basic understanding to the use and abuse of data would be highly valuable, and perhaps it should become essential. That basic literacy and exposure essential to the future students, just like the ability to add numbers and read words. Perhaps not quite at that basic level, but getting there. For example, you mentioned early on in the opening, Gerry, should all the students in a college take data science courses, right? Well, every single student, I'm not sure. Perhaps one day, but at least those who are in the engineering college right now, well, going through department by department, school by school, to pass this graduation requirement that we call data mind. Is a mindset that you have at least taken one credit hour course that we are offering right now to give you the basic exposure as an engineering student. Now, should that be equally applicable to every student, the theater major out there, for example, that they must have taken a 4-credit course, or are there other ways to give them that exposure? That's something we can talk about. But within the College of Engineering, this will become a graduation requirement. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to devote any time more than that very basic 1-credit-hour unit.
Thank you, Pat.
And I think, you know, the university's kind of core curriculum committee is sort of grappling with Mung's broader question right now. What should our commitment be, you know, at Purdue, for example, but more generally, you know, what should our commitment be to equip all of our students with some basic competencies in sort of, you know, how to make sense of data? That might be very quantitative in some cases. I mean, someone who's going into an engineering or more broadly a STEM subject might expect to have quite a quantitative dose. But even a qualitative dose, I think, is pretty valuable. Just as important as the kind of the tide of excitement about big data is perhaps the notion that we need to be a little bit careful not to get fully swept up into it. So learning about, you know, the fundamental limitations of data science, the ways in which you can, you know, accidentally be sort of fooled. You know, for example, Google put a huge amount of work into a predictive tracker of outbreaks of the flu, and that turned out to give some results that in the end were pretty nonsensical. Being aware of the kind of limitations and the potential of current methodologies allows you to really understand data-driven decision making. And I think that's probably going to continue to become of even more central importance in all of our lives. The other thing I would suggest, I fully agree with Mung's endorsement to, you know, sort of follow what you're passionate about in school, whether that's you know, science and mathematics leading on to engineering, or the life sciences, the physical sciences, or whether it's something else. But remember that the reason that we have so many successful technologies right now in artificial intelligence and machine learning and data sciences is because people were working on these things in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s out of their own, you know, personal interest, not because it was a hot thing, not because it was voted sexiest job in America, et cetera, et cetera. You never can quite tell, you know, I think it's always better in the long run to, you know, to follow a path that makes you want to get out of bed in the morning and study or create or do than it is to try to kind of time the market for these opportunities. And again, I mean, literally, we talk often about an AI winter, a period of about 20 years when artificial intelligence was overhyped in the 80s and 90s. But guess what? The person who heads Facebook's AI lab was one of the people who kept slogging away through 20 years of AI winter. And now, of course, we're at some kind or another of dawn for AI quite clearly. So that would be my other piece of guidance is, you know, get smart, get current with what's happening, but you know, don't get too attached to any one thing if you're not super passionate about it. There's lots here to do, but as Mung said, who knows what the big drivers will be in, you know, 5, 10, 20 years.
Great. We have a question here.
Hi, my name is Chanel Beebe. I'm a PhD candidate in engineering education, and I'm also a master's student in industrial engineering. My question comes first in appreciation for kind of this understanding that data science cannot go without data literacy. I think it is very important that especially our engineering students are, like you said, at least able at a fundamental level to understand what's happening with these things, even if it's not a passion of theirs. To me, the importance of that stems from this concept that hasn't really directly been explicitly said by anyone on the panel, but I think is this concept of data justice, in the sense that people need to be aware of the data that's around them and how it's affecting them. I have a comment and a question related to that idea. My comment is, as we teach our engineers this idea of data literacy and data science, I think it's important that we situate these things within the social implications of these things, because often we miss what happens beyond just the interface, right? And what happens beyond just the conception of what Google does. A couple months ago, maybe weeks ago, I'm not sure, I'm a grad student, so time passes weirdly. Professor Noble was here talking about algorithms of oppression, and she talked about how within Google there are a lot of biases that are kind of embedded into the technology that Google may or may not have been addressing. But one implication that she brought up was the case of, I can't remember his name, but the guy who shot up the church with all the black church, and how he had Googled Trayvon Martin because he didn't really know what it was. He continued to Google black on white crime and found a lot of information that kind of confirmed his existing bias. And she talked about how had he put the same search terms into like a library database instead of Google, he would have gotten an entirely different thing, right? So I think as we're thinking about this data justice aspect, what responsibility do you think institutions have in terms of educating people of how to engage with this large data set that they now have at their fingertips, right? Because Google is pervasive, but it's also more of an advertising platform than it is than an actual information platform, right? So what role do you think institutions should play in educating people around the justice related to the data that they're interacting with?
So two quick things. I think this comes back to number one, something I said a moment ago about understanding and educating all of us about the fundamental limitations of these methods. So a now classic case in point occurred in the city of Boston, where there was an idea to have a smartphone app that would allow you to report, sort of potholes. And, Boston's a little bit like here. It gets lots of snow in the winter. The roads get torn up. And some folks working on this were pretty enamored by the notion that after this app had been out there for a while, they felt like they had a great read from big data on the prevalence of potholes in Boston streets. So what do you think they actually measured? Mostly they measured the prevalence of smartphones in Boston, right? Because you can't report potholes using your smartphone app if you don't have a smartphone. So that's a potentially benign example, except for the fact that then if funding flows to different parts of Boston streets and sanitation based on the smartphone app, then, exactly as you said, big data can reinforce and drive some of these inequities. So, but it comes down to me to understanding no technology is a panacea. Garbage in, garbage out, as the computer scientists say it, or as we would talk about in statistics, you've got to be very careful that that the population you're measuring is the one that you think you're measuring. Mistaking smartphone users for all Boston citizenry is a pretty basic error of judgment. The second thing I just wanted to say specifically is we've got this residential learning community, the data mine, that started at Purdue this year with 200, and we'll go to 800 by next year. I was at a meeting of the MLK Day celebrations group yesterday, and we talked about exactly what you suggested, which is, can we get the residential learning community involved with some of the kind of data science, social justice questions, kind of, in honor of, if you like, ML King Day. And I think there are huge opportunities to have a data-driven conversation about inequities and inequalities in society. We just have to make sure that we get our frame of reference right so that we don't make the Boston smartphone app mistake. And I think we would take pride here at Purdue in educating all of our students in a way that helps them see the picture for what it is so that we can start to make progress on some of these issues. But Mung, I'm sure you've got thoughts to add.
Well, my most important thought is to make a correction that I don't think that Boston is like Indianapolis. It snows a whole lot more.
Fair enough.
I only have one winter here, but I think we had maybe 3% of Bostonian snowfall. Other than that, yes, very much agree with what Patrick just said. And maybe I'll just echo that and add to that. And little anecdote. When I was writing my book based on the massive open online course, I interviewed a few visionaries, and I interviewed Eric Schmidt. And back then, he just stepped down as CEO, but was still the chairman of the board at that time. So I asked Eric a bunch of questions. If you want to know the detail, please go to Amazon to buy my book, or just
It'll be recommended to you.
just rate 5 stars. You don't have to spend real money. Amazon wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But anyway, so the point being that I asked Eric a bunch of questions. One of which is, why would we feel comfortable to trust a large corporation with the data? Among the many bullet points that Eric provided in his answer, the one that I think is quite relevant to this topic is the freedom to debate and the freedom to argue. I think it's one of the underlying root causes he was alluding to. But generally speaking, I think the key really is let there be freedom of thoughts and expression, and let different parts and different sides of the issue or the data be able to be given a fair chance to disagree with each other. And that's how we may be able to avoid the most dooming situation. I keep referring to your, Gerry, to your conference name, because it's such a good one. That might be the best guarantee against the most doomsday scenario.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you for.
We can hear you, but I'm not sure if the audience.
Just shout, it'll be fine.
Yeah, so, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. So my question to you is, so I was at that talk, the same talk with Dr. Noble, and I want to get into more detail with that answer. I want to understand the other side. So my question is, so let's say humans have beliefs, and the way they get their beliefs is through their experiences and the information they receive through any medium. And Google is one medium where people get their information. Let's say I go into Google, type something. Let's say I type, the earth is flat. I'm going to have 1,000 search results that pop up saying the earth is flat. So my question is, and the person's going to believe that the earth is flat because he has evidence saying that yes, it is flat. So, and those are sources that he trusts. So my question is, where does the responsibility lie? With whose responsibility is it to deliver the right information? Is it the consumers, us, who seek information, or is it Google who's acting as that medium, or is it Congress or people who make public policy? So how much of responsibility is with?
That's an interesting question.
Well, I'm not here to defend Google either as a business entity or its mathematical algorithms, a lot of which details are also trade secrets, but I'm not here to defend them. In fact, I started by calling them as increasingly becoming evil in many aspects. And I'm remain hopeful that they will revert their direction, go back to their original starting point of do no harm. Now, having said that, on this particular point, I happen to agree with what I heard back to that interview with Eric Schmidt. If I could paraphrase his answer, which I asked almost the same question, right? What if a lot of people start creating websites and pointing to each other and trick your algorithm to say that the earth is flat, right? Wouldn't that pop up as the #1 right below all your advertisements, right? I think the answer that I heard, if I remember correctly, is that, well, we trust that it's an open society with the freedom of expression, and people who disagree with that statement will soon, maybe not within that same second or minute, they will soon start creating a lot more other websites and start to say the earth is not flat. Those websites are not telling you the scientific truth. Google's responsibility, paraphrasing what I heard, is not to take sides, a priori, but to enable a free environment where people can disagree. Now, one could argue, but sometimes the wisdom of crowds turns into the fallacy of crowds. Hundreds of years ago, the majority of the people, if they had the tool, actually believed the earth is flat. And very few individuals actually would take a different viewpoints. What about that, right? That I don't think there is an easy direct solution from Google's algorithms. But the same principle I continue to believe is that if you give people the freedom to disagree with each other, with oneself, with the prevalent ideas and the narratives in the world, then a fair platform that can encourage and extract information out of free conversations and free disagreement is the best guarantee one could hope for. It's not ideal still, but it's probably the best guarantee against the worst case scenario.
I think Google's and Facebook's positions are becoming increasingly difficult to defend in the sense that these organizations have gone more and more recently to kind of human moderators to try to, in some cases, for example, root out fake news and things like this. I mean, you can do a little bit of this with current sort of machine learning technologies, but I think it's proving harder than than folks thought to do this effectively. I mean, to me, it does come down to really to evidence-based reasoning and to education. I mean, if we dig deeper than that, we can talk about sort of the philosophy of science, and that's probably, and the Enlightenment and the scientific method, and I'm not sure we want to unpack that can of worms in this morning session, but I would submit to you. I mean, for example, so there is a flat Earth society. You can read about it in the New Yorker. It was written up in the last 6 months in a fairly sort of cloying feature article, which I think had the unfortunate side effect of sort of making fun of a whole class of people who kind of have this idea. And any of us who have flown on an airplane and observed the curvature of the Earth, which are with our own eyes, might quibble with this. We can talk about moon landing conspiracies and the spirit of Neil Armstrong and all sorts of other things. But I think, again, to me, an educated citizenry, a populace who understand the basic principles of evidence-based reasoning and decision-making, I mean, to me, that's our best defense against the nonsense. And again, I would bring it back to what we try to do as educators. I think we try to, give young people the tools to make smart decisions about how they trust the evidence in the world around them and what they hear and what they see with their own eyes. So I know we've got, I think, more questions coming on the other side, so I think I'll just stop my answer there.
So.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Around the high table talking. My name is Christian Ekeigwe. I come from an accounting background as a CPA, and I worked for a Big Four firm. In accounting, we are actually concerned about the fairness of value that we present to shareholders and to the public, because at the end of the day, every company is a public, has some public interest attached to it because we are all affected by what they do. So many things have happened in the economy worldwide, on Wall Street, and we hear stories like brokers and financial people who are using AI, analytics, financial modeling, and all that. The world has paid quite a lot of price for that. That is, if we succeed in saying that those are responsible. In the 1980s, we are all aware of the savings and loans industry, Michael Milken. In the 90s, Nick Leeson and Barron's Bank. Later, 2002, have Enron and Scaling. And of course, we have 9/11. Then we have, for the purpose of intellectual discussion, I will call it conspiracy theory about the election meddling, because we don't know exactly what the facts are. Now, what connects all of them is judgment. That's one nexus for all of them. And when that judgment goes wrong, the economy pays a lot of price for it. And here we have technologies that we are trying to depend on to take decisions that humans ordinarily would take. I'm a technology person, I love technology. But I believe that there's a limitation for any artifact that doesn't have a biological mind. The biological mind will always be superior in taking decisions at critical times. Now, how do you think we are going to help to close the gap between what machines tell us and what we do? Let me give you an example. There is a concept we call necessary non-standard. It cannot be exercised in judgment by a machine. Only a biological entity can know that this is a necessary non-standard and we've got to do it and do it for only limited time and then resume to what is standard that everyone does. So what future do you think we have to limit all these issues that I've just mentioned? Thank you very much.
I think rather than risk trying to kind of boil the ocean on that question, let me just focus on one salient point. You know, most people in the room are probably familiar in one way or another with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that was passed in the EU recently. It's the thing that's responsible for you having to click yes to cookies on lots more websites these days. GDPR, among other things, and this is untested in law, okay? GDPR provides for the right to an explanation if you, as an EU citizen or a consumer, are subject to a decision by machine, a decision by algorithm. So I think many of the questions that you're raising are about to be put to the test over the next several years in case law, for example, because there's no clear guidance as to what the right to an explanation of an algorithmic decision even means. I mean, to Mung's point earlier, does it mean Gerry was denied for his auto loan because of a convex combination of 186 features based on his social media profile, or does the right to an explanation mean that at the end of the day, Gerry's socioeconomic status just unfortunately puts him in the bucket where he is statistically unlikely to be able to repay that loan, right? And we just don't know. And of course, I wouldn't dare to make any assumptions about Gerry's car loan status. But I think you can kind of see the broader point. And this brings us back to something we kind of started to touch on earlier, which is the kind of growing gap between technologists and policymakers. This area has matured so quickly. There's no way that regulatory environments can keep pace. Public policy experts and lawyers, frankly, don't have the first idea really of what an algorithm is. Why would they? There just hasn't been time for any of that infrastructure to get set up. So I mean, I think if we want to kind of drive this in the most societally productive directions possible, I think it's incumbent upon us as technologists and educated members of the populace to kind of work a little bit to bridge that gap. I mean, I've personally spent time working with law groups to try to help educate them about, I usually tell them that an algorithm is like a recipe. A cookbook contains lots of algorithms. You start with some inputs, you do some things, you get some outputs. But I think we all bear some responsibility to help sort of shrink that gap a little bit. And I think that's the only way that's going to help us get the sensible answers to the types of questions that you're posing. Mung?
Well, I would imagine there's no machine learning algorithm. This is a conjecture that I'm putting out there today. No machine learning algorithm would derive a conclusion whereby Gerry cannot repay his loans. Now, having made a prediction about all classes of machine learning algorithms, let me come back to this question on what can a machine do that, or what can a human do that a machine cannot. On the one hand, I'll say that there's this neuromorphic computing research field whereby Purdue is the leader. In fact, this is one of the areas where Purdue faculty member is already in the national, international preeminence. If you go to, say, engineering.purdue.edu, like right now, you will see a banner story talking about the Seabrick Center that the colleague in EC, Kaushik Roy, and others are leading the nation. And the idea there, if I could paraphrase, is that rather than looking at the traditional way of thinking about computer engineering, where you have got memory, and then you've got a processor, and that's the von Neumann architecture. It's a powerful paradigm. And they say, well, maybe biological brains don't work like that, and human brains don't work like that, and maybe we should be inspired by how human brains work. I'm no expert in that area, but neuromorphic computing is going one direction to say how can machines borrow ideas from how the human and other biological operations work. Now, on the other hand, one could argue that there must be some things that no matter how advanced AIs are, and no matter how many thousands and tens of thousands of STEM students, Purdue graduates, that a human will be able to do at least better, and perhaps just fundamentally capable of doing something that the machines are not able to do. I have heard examples like the ability to laugh and the ability to make up new jokes. I've heard an answer like the ability to cry and feel emotion. I've heard of answers like the ability to make new machines. And maybe all of those eventually, we'll have to look at where we stand. I think somewhere in between, an interesting example is translation. Okay. Now, if you're translating a user manual, and I think Google or many other companies out there can do a pretty good job these days. Translating poems, for example, on the other hand, is a very different story. I've tried the translators available online, and I put in a poem by, say, by Keats. And I translate it into very different kinds of languages, like Japanese and Chinese and Korean and so on. And I basically got garbage. For sure, it doesn't strike me as beautiful, and it doesn't even strike me as accurate either, right? So I would put another conjecture out there. I guess I'll be proven wrong many times today, and that is the machines still won't be able to not only create art and beauty, but even, let's say, translate poems. Which is harder than translating novels by a large margin. It wouldn't be able to translate poems and give you a very different language and let the people who can only speak that language feel that as if this were written by a human in that language. I would say the day that machines can achieve that would still be at least a decade out. Just to be very precise and wrong, right? At least a decade out, if not more. Mm-hmm. So the time when we get to the point where machines can laugh and cry may not be in my lifetime.
This is your poetry Turing test, as it were.
The poetry Turing test, yes. And the humans are the testers. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I have to say the great questions, actually, I enjoyed all three questions, and they reminded me of an old joke from my trade, computer services, which is,
yes.
What's the difference between a used car salesman and a software salesman? The used car salesman knows when he's lying. So, and that's the challenge here for us is that, however wearing it is, we have to be skeptical and informed and check and remeasure. And algorithms are always inevitably shortcuts to things so that I don't have to do all of this other work. I can just take, but understanding how those shortcuts are arrived at is the challenge that we face as a citizenry. And I think you've answered this question earlier today, earlier in this session, but being informed and understanding what's going on is a key takeaway, I think, for all of us. I would like to thank so much Mung and Patrick for joining us here, and for you all for joining us for this. I think they might even make the mistake of hanging around for a few minutes after we're done here if you want to buttonhole them with a question that you didn't want to say in public. All right, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gerry.
Well done.